Hello, everyone. My name is Cassidy Diamond, and I am the Public Programs and Events Manager here at the International Documentary Association. I'm really excited for tonight's conversation about the documentary Becoming with Director Nadia Helgren. It's going to be a great conversation. Before we start, I wanted to do some land acknowledgements that we like to do here at the beginning of all of our IDA events. We come to you, most of us, from Los Angeles today on the occupied land of the Tongva and the Chumash people who have stewarded this land for generations. We'd like to acknowledge the indigenous people on whose land we stand on. So I'm not going to keep you very long. I'm going to hand this off to our panel. I'm going to bring up Travell Anderson, who is the co-host of the podcast Fanti. And I'm going to bring him up right here, and they are going to introduce you to Nadia and have a great conversation. So Travell, it is all yours.
Hello, thanks so much for having me, and I'm going to jump right into it as well. Let's welcome in Nadia, director of Becoming. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for giving us some of your time to
All right,
discuss
thank you for yours.
Becoming. To get us started, I kind of want to start with like the beginning. Like, how did you get this job of a lifetime to follow Mrs. Obama around? I want to take notes so that I can figure out my chance.
So I'll start at the very beginning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sort of the way I am right now, and phone rings. It's a call from Priya Swaminathan, and Priya runs High Ground Productions, and she says to me, Michelle Obama is getting ready to go on this sort of worldwide book tour, and we're floating the idea of documenting it. We don't know yet if it may be a film or the footage would just be something that lives in Mrs. Obama's archive, but is this something that you're interested in? And of course, I was like, absolutely. But there were a few layers that I had to go through before any of this was confirmed. And so, there were a few phone calls, and then one day I get an email that says you have an appointment at the office of Michelle and Barack Obama. And I kind of just like jaw dropped and got really scared. And then I was like, oh my God, what do I do? And I was like, how do you prepare to, meet with the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, and, figure out a way to land this job. And so what I did was I decided to, go back and listen to every speech that I could find that Michelle Obama had done. I read every magazine feature. I went back and read both of the president's books again. And I thought about what we both, what is my connection point with Michelle Obama? Mm-hmm. What is it that we, can talk about? And, we both deeply believe in storytelling and, the power of storytelling and what it means to share our stories. So, I had 3 weeks before actually, the date that I was going to be meeting her. And during this time, I really just focused on, thinking about what a conversation with her would be like.
I love that. So how would you say, you're not new to the documentary game. How would you say like your prior work like prepared you for this particular moment and to tell this particular story, whether it's The New Black or Gavin Grimm Versus? How do you think those experiences like brought you to this point?
Sure. So I have spent over 15 years as a documentary cinematographer. And so, a huge reason why I was equipped to make this film was that there was an understanding, when you are rolling with Michelle Obama, things happen very quickly. There could potentially, be times when a very small footprint was needed. And, my background as a cinematographer, as well as working on super low budget docs from the very beginning, meant that I I could sort of one person band it when I had to, which means I was able to direct, I was able to shoot, and sometimes do my own sound. And I felt very comfortable with that, you know, amidst all the stuff that was happening around me. So that was definitely something that prepared me. And, you know, I think in looking back at some of my other work, I am really interested in, you know, an identity and what makes
Mm-hmm.
people who they are, and you know, what compels people to sort of take on the things in the world that they do. And, you know, having spent a career thinking deeply about those things, I think it really, you know, it prepared me to jump in the seat of directing the coming.
Yeah, so now I feel like the Obamas and Mrs. Obama in particular, I mean, the images that we have of them are, you know, they're the political ones. They're filtered through the idea of the presidency, right? But with the film, you kind of get a chance to go behind the scenes and get a little bit more into Michelle Obama's story in particular. I'm wondering what your process was like in terms of figuring out exactly what the arc of the story of the film would be. Were you able to do that before you started recording?
So the only thing I knew before I sort of jumped into this journey with Mrs. Obama was that she was going on this book tour. You know, she was going to be sharing her story with these, you know, just huge audiences, but
Mm-hmm.
also she was going to take time on every stop to meet with community groups and, you know, young people and have these like more intimate conversations with them. And I saw that as an opportunity, you know, going back to this idea of storytelling, was thinking about the ways in which sharing our stories and taking in stories can be
Mm-hmm.
transformative, how that transforms us. And not only seeing how it transforms the people that are listening to Michelle Obama, but also how it transforms Michelle Obama. And so that was something that I was really interested in going into this filmmaking process, thinking about, as well as the interconnectedness of all of us. So, you know, when Michelle Obama goes and talks to a 16-year-old girl in Philadelphia, you know, in many ways, this young woman who we see in the film, Shayla, her life mirrors a young Michelle Robinson, you know,
Mm-hmm.
between having this mom that is very committed to education and, you know, her children, to a brother that they have a very wonderful, playful relationship. And so we sort of, you know, in the film, we see those things mirrored. But that's what I went in knowing or thinking that I wanted to do. But a lot of what happened, what we see in the film was just born out of my time with Mrs. Obama and observing her and
Mm.
kind of just picking up things really quickly to me that stood out about her, outside of, you know, all the amazing things that we already know that and who she is as a person.
I think that's one of my favorite parts about the film is these other stories that we get, in addition to Michelle Obama's arc and her story and how she came to the White House. We also get the stories of these young women and young people, and how there is a connection between kind of their experiences, their stories, and this woman who was able to along with her husband, go into the White House. I think to that very end, right, there are one of the things I love is the ways in which race play into the story. I feel like when the Obamas were elected, people thought that we were in a post-racial society, and I think some of the unrest that we see out in the street right now is demonstrating that we weren't quite there. In what ways did kind of that aspect of Michelle Obama's story, was it important for you to incorporate into the film?
Sure. You know, I think from reading Mrs. Obama's book, which is incredible, I really had an opportunity to study some of the experiences that she had in her lifetime that were particularly, like changed who she was and had a really profound effect. And, like many Black people in America, a lot of them have to do with race, whether it was, getting into Princeton and then, later learning that her roommate, who was a young white girl, that her mom had felt uncomfortable that she had a Black roommate and had asked for her daughter to be transferred out of sharing a room with Michelle Obama at the time, Michelle Robinson at the time. To, this idea that when the Obamas were elected, that some, you know, people were saying that we had entered this post-racial society, and, you know, race was not as much of an issue as it had been in America in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But for many of us, we were having a completely different experience under the Obama administration, particularly in terms of police violence against Black folks and all the other sort of systemic issues that we have faced as a country overall. And, you know, something that stood out to me was Mrs. Obama very specifically speaking to her own experience watching this happen in America, which is something I had never thought of. And I remember I had gotten this like advanced copy of the book before I had been bound or anything like that. And so what I told myself was, I'm gonna sit and read this book, and anytime I get emotional, I'm just gonna highlight it, right? I'm just I'm whether it's funny, whether it makes me cry or whatever, I'm just gonna highlight it. These are the things that move me. And it's very sort of late in the book, but I remember coming upon a passage where she talks about the experience that she had seeing all these young people being murdered by police. You know, she mentions, you know, Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and other individuals. And she says, we ourselves were a provocation. And I remember reading that line and just taking complete pause, putting the book down and just like weeping. And it just moved me so much. And in that moment, I was like, this has to be in the film. Like, I don't know how, I don't know where, but this experience has to be in the film because it's also the experience of all Black people in America. Whether you are on the streets of Ferguson or you are in the White House, like this is what we know to be true. And this is a life that we have always lived. So in this moment when this has, you know, this country is on the streets and protesting and responding to more violence against Black people, you know, so I think in this moment, when we see the world responding to violence against Black people in the way that they are, you know, I think understanding Mrs. Obama's perspective is, you know, is really interesting.
Definitely. And I also, when I was first watching it, you know, there were different shots that for me signal that, oh, there's probably like a person of color, in particular a Black person, behind this camera. And for me, one of those scenes is like the ways you would linger on how she would embrace other folks, particularly Black folks, whether she's at a book signing and, you know, there's a woman who doesn't want to let go as the people are trying to usher her off, and like the lingering there. I think it's those types of moments that help documentary films like elevate them to something that we all can feel. But let's talk about the actual capturing of it all. You directed it, but you also did a lot of the shooting, if not all of the shooting yourself. So for the filmmaking enthusiasts out there, what equipment were you using? How were you able to, you know, navigate these different spaces so easily?
Yeah, so my approach to making this film was actually, it changed very quickly. So I had this idea that I was gonna go into this film with like, you know, all the fancy gear and like, you know, I have a budget to do all this stuff. And so, but that changed very quickly. I think within my first day filming with Mrs. Obama, I realized that this was not like any other documentary that I had ever worked on before. You know, Mrs. Obama is flanked by Secret Service everywhere she goes. She moves very quickly. There's no like, can you slow down for the camera? Or, you know, there's definitely no, can you do that again? It's like, you are moving. And the Secret Service, who were amazing with me, they were just like, just don't slow her down. Like, you could do whatever you want, but don't slow her down. You know, there are safety and security issues around that. And so that meant that I had to move really fast. I could not be weighed down with too much equipment. And so I really just dug into my kit that is like the most basic. slimmed down version for me, which I shot on a Sony FS7. I had Canon, telephoto lenses in essentially, which were, I shot on 24-105 Canon lens and a 16-35 mainly, which I kept on my body the whole time with a waist pack. And that was how I made this film. So it was definitely, there were no bells and whistles in terms of the verite that I was filming. But it really worked to help me get really close and intimate with Mrs. Obama. I think I was having such an incredible experience being with her that all I kept telling myself was, I want an audience to feel the way I feel right now. I want everyone to feel like they're riding shotgun with Michelle Obama in her motorcade. I want people to know what it feels like to experience the special quality of warmth that you're describing, like on that book line. I remember when we were going to film, and it's like, you just film whatever she's doing. And they're like, okay, she's doing a book signing. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, how interesting could that be, right? A little cynical as a filmmaker. And so I go in, and there's hundreds of people waiting for her. And a young woman who works with her, China, grabs a box of tissues. And I'm like, what's that for? And she's like, oh, people get emotional. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me, And so I go in and I start filming, and 10 minutes later, I come out in tears, also emotional. And I was like, that really surprised me. And then I was like, what is it that is making me so emotional? Like, she's just signing books and shaking hands, but as you mentioned, there's this special quality, this special warmth to the way that she connects with people that I had never experienced before. And I knew it was something that I had to document in a way that was very immersive, that made people feel like they were right there with her.
So now when you're in the editing room, I assume you had entirely too much footage because you were following her at each stop. What was that experience like, sitting down with the footage and piecing things together for you?
Sure. So first I want to say I had an unbelievable edit team working with me on this film. Could not have made any of this happen without them. So we had some really smart, thoughtful folks that, we were able to sit in a room, and as we started to string out the film and try and create the arc. And there were so many moments that, as happens with every film, that we had to take out because it just didn't fit into the story, or our runtime was too long. But there were just sort of these really, it's interesting because there were these stories, again, that I think from the very beginning, from reading her book, that I knew I wanted to include in the film. One of them was even the story she tells about, I remember we called the scene Escaping the White House, but it's basically, she tells the story of the day that she went to the Charleston funeral, and then that same day goes back home, and marriage passes.
Yes.
And there's a celebration happening outside the White House, and she's like, I need to know what this progress feels like, because, I need to know that we're moving the needle in some way. And that story to me was such this amazing range of emotion in one day that really brought me closer to understanding or even imagining what her life might have been like. But then we also had these special unexpected moments, like, the interaction with her and Craig, her brother, which they just have such a wonderful relationship that, I didn't know all that much about, but watching them together was just so much fun. And we had a lot of scenes like that, and where, we would just be dying laughing, and having to cut stuff like that is always heartbreaking out of a film, because you want everyone to see all the great stuff that you saw. So that was kind of what the editorial process was like for us. It was very hard.
You mentioned her family. That's one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, like, you are getting the behind the scenes of Mrs. Obama, but as well as her family. Could you talk a little bit about the experience of interviewing her siblings and her family members about their experience of her through this process?
Sure. So, it's funny. So Mrs. Robinson, who I love very much, she is awesome. She is like the realest person I've ever met. She's like super practical, and she does not like, you know, as she says, there are millions of Craigs, Michelle, and Barack Obamas all over the South Side of Chicago. She does not think her kids are special, and she reminds them of that. So it's just this like wonderful quality that she has. But you know, when I first met her, she had been known to not talk to cameras while they were in the White House. You know, she rarely made any appearances, and you know, she appreciated her anonymity and her and so, you know, that wasn't really part of, she didn't engage in that while they were in the White House. And so, you know, imagine me being there with a camera was probably the first time that a camera had actually been so intimate and close to Michelle Obama as well as her family. So this was something that was unprecedented. Like the access had never happened before. So I remember the first time Mrs. Robinson sees me with a camera, she just looks at me like, what are you doing? And I was like, hi, you know, I'm Nadia. And she's kind of like, don't you point that thing at me. And I was like, okay. And so over time, we developed a relationship. And I think we see the culmination of that relationship in the scene when Michelle goes back with her mother to visit her childhood home. And, you know, they really both go to this very emotional place talking about her dad and sort of like, you know, bringing up these memories of her father. And, you know, Mrs. Robinson is so beautifully expressive in that moment. And for me, that was really special that she, you know, we sort of had this evolution from her not wanting to even be on camera to feeling comfortable to express herself in that way with the camera there and completely unself-conscious and in the moment. And I every time I watch that scene, I get emotional, not only because it's so powerful on its own, but just knowing where we had come to in terms of a relationship, you know, and that she did that. So yeah, it was awesome. It was so hard. I mean, there were times when I was laughing so hard while I was filming, you know, her and Craig especially, because they're so funny. I was just like trying to really hold the camera still so I didn't like ruin the shot. But it was like that, you know. They really embraced me, and they're such a warm, loving family, and they treated me like family. They treated me exactly the same. So, you know.
I love that. I imagine that when it comes to doing this type of film, and getting this type of access to someone who, you know, you probably wouldn't necessarily get such an access to, that it requires you to sometimes, you know, like try to blend into the background, even though you might have a camera with you. I'm wondering if there's like is there like a piece of advice or something that you would give to other filmmakers in terms of doing this specific type of documentary filmmaking when you're following someone who might be high profile, you might not be able to slow them down, or you might have to navigate Secret Service? Is there like a trick of the trade that you have that you would say for them?
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, what I try to do is just bring my personality to, and who I am to a space, you know, but for me that I'm sort of quiet. I like to be very focused when I'm working, so I don't talk a lot, and I just like have my head buried in my camera. Ms. Obama used to always be like, what are you doing in there? You know, any behind the scenes photo you see, it's just me. Like, you can always see my hair. And like, I'm in an eyepiece. And that's how for me, the most powerful part of especially verite filming is body language. And so I'm always trying to like focus in on the details of body language that can help tell the story, besides what it is that people are saying. So for me to be able to pick up on that, I just have to be super locked in. And so I that's how I kind of carry about my day. And I think in some ways, you know, Ms. Obama just really appreciated my presence. And, you know, I like to smile at people. When people sort of like make eye contact with the camera, I just smile and be like, hey, you know. But I think just be yourself, bring yourself. And, but, focus, meditation, I think all that stuff really helps when it comes to
Hmm.
karate. Hmm.
Is there like a technique or like an art of filmmaking skill that you learned throughout this process or that you perfected throughout this particular filmmaking?
That's a great question. Um, I what I probably learned from this experience was to trust my instincts.
Mm,
Um, and you know, again, I think some of the things in the film that I'm most proud of are things that may not be the most obvious storytelling tacks to take,
mhm,
that were maybe more complicated to do. For example, including other people's stories in
mm,
the film. It was hard to figure out how to incorporate those things, but it was something that I really felt strongly about. And so I would say that's something that I really learned. Like, you just trust yourself. I think that
mhm,
we have instincts that we have to stand firm on, and work hard to keep them in our art and keep them in our work. And I also think my life experience
mhm.
that may be different from other collaborators, that compels me to say, like, this has to be in the movie. I think that that's something that makes, it's what we bring to the table. It's what makes our work unique. And
Mhm.
being able to maintain that, I think, is really important. And I walked away knowing that those decisions were ultimately right in the end.
Is there something that you, well, let me first ask, did you go to every single stop of the book tour? Like how long was your process of following Mrs. Obama around?
Sure. So I didn't go to every single stop of the tour. Part of that was, we turned this film around very quickly.
Mm,
And we were filming and editing concurrently. So there were times when I jumped off the tour, I came back to New York, you know, brought footage to the edit, sat with my editors, like mapped stuff out, and then I would jump back on the tour.
mm.
Um, so I think I went with her to about 23 cities out of the 34 that she did.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It was pretty rigorous. Fortunately, I have the documentary filmmaking chops to just be on the road for a long period of time. And as she said, she has like the campaigning chops. So
Right.
everyone was kind of like moving along, but by the end we were like, whoa, that was a lot. But it was like absolutely the most incredible, life-changing experience for sure, to be
How
honest.
did editing while still shooting impact your process? I'm assuming that's not typical.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it gave an opportunity to, as we started to craft the story, also be able to, you sort of like flag things that you're really enjoying about the film, or perhaps story threads that you
Hmm.
want to continue. And so when you're out in the field and you see those things happening, it's kind of like that, that signal goes off that it's like, yes, this is the thing that I want to be able to develop further in the film. And then you can bring that footage right back into the edit, drop it in, and help move the story forward in that way. So it was I really liked being able to do that, for this particular film. Yeah.
Hmm. Is there something that I'm wondering, like, I feel like doing a film like this could change a person, like being on the road this long, having this access with the Mrs. Obama and her family, and having to run around backstage at these different stadiums. How do you think this process changes or has changed your approach to filmmaking, broadly speaking, if it has at all?
I mean, I think this experience has changed me as a person and a filmmaker in every way possible. Like, I
Mm,
felt like I came out of this a different person. Um, like many of us, there were times when I was just like, can I even do this? Can I make this film? It's kind of like those voices of doubt that
mm-hmm.
creep up when we are, the expectation is high. I knew that, you know, the world expected a lot from this film,
Yeah.
and it's knowing that you're not going to please everyone all the time, that everyone wants something different. There were times when I wasn't sure if I was the right person to do this or if I could handle it.
Mm-hmm.
And, one message that Mrs. Obama spreads to the world is that, we are stronger than we think we are. We are, way beyond capable.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it's other people in our lives that have underestimated us, that make us feel that we are incapable. And so, like, don't listen to those voices, figure out how to shut them down and shut them out, stay focused and do what you know how to do. And I think that was something that, hearing her say this over and over and over again to an audience or to someone else, it just resonated with me personally. And it just gave me a tremendous amount of strength to be able to like power through and to be able to, make this film. And so it was really transformative for me in every way possible.
I love that. The last question I want to ask you, my favorite scene is the one where you're in the car with her and she's trying to find, a song, and then the song that she selects, right? What's your favorite scene or your favorite moment that you were able to capture and that makes it into the final film?
I have a few. I think both scenes with Mrs. Robinson and Craig, there's one that we call the belt scene when Craig is teasing her about her belt. That still makes me laugh. I've seen it like 400 times. There's another one when they're home, they're at Craig's house, and they're sort of it's right before they start looking at the family photos,
Mm-hmm.
and Craig is teasing her about the wine. It's like we call it the wine scene, but it's also this other thing where Mrs. Obama's like, Craig's the favorite, and she talks about that, and then it's sort of the scene that supports that idea in the family. So that's my other favorite scene, and then the scene back at her childhood home where we sort of get this very vivid picture of how Mrs. Robinson grew up.
Mm-hmm.
In that house, there is still her childhood bedroom with her doll on the bed. It's amazing. I remember when I first walked in there, I just had chills all over my body.
Mm-hmm.
Her and President Obama lived in that house together, and it's such a humble, modest home. It's just, there's so much richness and history in that space, and that we were able to go in there and share that, as well as, again, going back to Mrs. Robinson and being able to have that moment with her where she gets really emotional reminiscing about her husband. To me, that scene also, it just moved me so much. And so yeah, those are my favorite scenes in the movie.
I love that. Is there any like lasting message or takeaway that you hope audiences have from the film before we go?
Sure. So, I think what I had hoped to do with this film was this. I always had in my mind that this film had to do many different things. It's a film of the moment, but I also see it as a historical film. So in 25 years, people can watch this film and understand something different than they did. And I think it also speaks differently to different people, different age ranges. And so I encourage people to go back and watch it again. I think that there's so much to learn from Mrs. Obama's experience. And I think that I'm really just so moved by the response that people have had to this film. People all over the world that I've gotten notes from, young people in India and in Kenya and like all these places that they see themselves in Mrs. Obama's story. They said they looked up the director and they saw me and they were like, "You look like me.
Aww.
I can't believe you made this film." So I think there's so much goodness and love in this project, and for people to be able to draw as much from that as they can.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nadia, for joining us.
All right. Thanks so much, Javel. It was great talking to you.
Yes.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.